But violent crimes in Dickinson, Texas are rare, so they assume Jennifer has run away. With each moment, their concern grows.
Even if she had run away being at 8 years old, she could be lost in one of these fields or could have been picked up as she was running away or something of that nature. So the first thing we wanted to do was go ahead and start searching the surrounding area.
Later that day, 9-year-old Cruz Nunez and his friends start a game of tag.
Be careful, guys.
In the overgrown field behind his house.
I remember the grass was at least my height.
The game barely begins before one of Cruz's playmates yells for him to come out of hiding.
Well, she was like, just go down the trail a little bit. And I said, for what? And she kept pushing me, and I was telling her, what is it? Is it a snake or a dog or something? Because I don't want to get bit by it.
Reluctantly, Cruz follows the trail a few more steps.
It started to curve a little bit, the trail did. When it curved, that's when I seen her.
A little girl is lying in the grass, and she appears to be dead.
She was, completely nude, and I just seen a bunch of blood, and it really bothered me. I never, I was little to see something like that.
What is it?
Cruz and his friends race back to his home.
I was such in a hurry, I missed the front step, and I fell inside the living room. And my mom and dad and everybody jumped up, and they were asking me what's going on, what's wrong with me. I told them there was somebody out here in the field, somebody was hurt, so they came running out here. That's when we called 911.
Police and rescue personnel rush to the scene.
Dispatch, I got a white female juvenile with a throat wound.
They immediately know the girl must be 8-year-old Jennifer Schuett.
Come on.
And she's barely clinging to life.
Stay with me.
I haven't seen a crime like it before in my years in law enforcement. It's undescribable.
Jennifer is airlifted to a hospital in Galveston. There, doctors determine she has been raped. And there's more. Her throat has been sliced from ear to ear, severing her vocal cords.
I was able to see the photographs from when she was in the hospital. The photographs that I saw depicted to me a young female that was deceased, and that's the way she looked to me.
Doctors labor to save Jennifer's life.
We just got her out of surgery. We're not sure if she's going to be okay yet, but we're...
They deliver the devastating news to her family that if she lives, she may never talk again. Jennifer has been silenced, leaving authorities helpless.
They had a victim who was alive, but they couldn't communicate with her. They couldn't get information from her as to what had taken place.
Fear grips the entire hospital staff, including Sharon McBride, a registered nurse who has a daughter Jennifer's age.
It was terrifying to think that something like this, could happen to my own daughter.
Nurse McBride encourages Jennifer to fight for her life and to somehow communicate to police who has done this to her.
I was just reassuring her and telling her how brave she was.
You have to wake up.
She needed, if she could, to try and do anything she could to help the police to find who did this, so that, for one, he couldn't hurt her again and couldn't hurt anybody else again.
Knowing a depraved criminal is on the loose, Dickinson police don't take any chances. They station an armed officer outside Jennifer's room.
Nobody went in that room that didn't have any business going into that room that wasn't a staff member that we knew. This man was determined to finish the job. We had to protect her from that. We did not know what we were up against.
Authorities prepare for the worst, in case the predator comes back for Jennifer or another child.
Well, this is need-driven behavior, and he has sexual fantasy that goes beyond what we could even understand.
We were very concerned. Matter of fact, this was just something unheard of. You really get uneasy about it. You know, is he going to strike again?
August 11th, 1990. In a Galveston hospital, 8-year-old Jennifer Schuett is fighting for her life after being found in an overgrown field, naked, sexually assaulted, and with her throat slit. Jennifer's parents have been told that if she survives, she may never talk again. Without Jennifer's voice, it will be almost impossible for investigators to track down her predator. And Dickinson, Texas police are desperate to find him.
There's always a clue. There's going to be something there, you just have to find it. And that's the hard part.
Investigators scour the site where Jennifer was found. Using an ultraviolet light, evidence technician John Pruitt discovers microscopic cotton fibers just feet from where the tiny victim was left.
My thought process at that time was, did this individual cut his own clothing off? Was he so focused on hurting this child that he cut his own clothing off? So those fibers were going to be important at one point if we could ever find something to match them to.
Police extend their search for evidence and find Jennifer's pink pajama top and cotton underwear 2 blocks away.
Dispatch, I need a forensics unit at the intersection of Holmes and Unicorn. I've got some evidence to be collected.
Wrapped around her clothes, a man's light blue t-shirt and a pair of men's underwear.
Finding that kind of evidence today would have been like, you know, the old cliche, finding the smoking gun. It would have been the golden egg of the case.
But at this time, DNA technology is in its infancy.
Back in 1990, a lot of people had never heard of DNA.
Dickinson PD sends the clothes to the country's leading DNA experts. The FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia.
The FBI laboratory had been doing DNA testing for 2 years at that time, and you needed a pretty good sized body fluid stain, either a blood stain or a semen stain about the size of a quarter.
As investigators wait for results, they work feverishly to establish any lead they can.
We couldn't rule out anything. There was nothing you could rule out at that time. Everything was ruled in.
To their amazement, they get an unexpected break. Thanks to the care of nurse Sharon McBride, Jennifer's condition improves. As she gains strength, the child seems anxious to communicate.
We finally got her some paper and pen, and she started writing things that way.
Nurse McBride and Dickinson police encourage Jennifer to work with a sketch artist.
Which one of these would you say would be closest? Can you remember what his face looked like?
I'm trying to think back.
These ones here?
She identifies her attacker as a white male in his 20s or 30s with short dark hair and a thick mustache.
Circle whatever color shirt he had on.
She describes his clothing, as well as the Buick automobile he was driving. And she writes, the man told her his name, Dennis. Police release the sketches to the media in the hopes someone will recognize Jennifer's attacker or the car. Leads pour in, but go nowhere.
it gets frustrating because you think that, oh wow, here we go, we've got a break in this case, and unfortunately we hit dead ends every time.
But what happens next
It's gonna be okay.
surprises everyone.
Doctor! She just made a noise.
Despite the dire prediction of her doctors, Jennifer begins to speak.
I think everybody was in tears when she talked. It was a miracle. It was.
Well, we were in the car.
Jennifer begins telling police everything that she experienced, and the details are excruciating.
My mother and I went to bed together, like usual, our nightly routine.
Sweet dreams.
And then in my sleep, I was itching my mosquito bites and kicking her. So she just asked me to please go and sleep in my own room that night. I went in there and I got out books in my piggy bank and fell asleep with my light on in my room, in my bed.
Around 2:30 a.m., in the dark of night, the unspeakable happened. An unidentified man snuck through the first-floor window of Jennifer's apartment.
The next thing I remember is feeling almost like I was in a dream, feeling like someone was running with me. And I opened my eyes, and this man that I did not know had me in his arms. I did try to scream, but he covered my nose and mouth immediately.
The man placed Jennifer in his car and drove away.
Fine.
In the car, her attacker tried to convince her he was a member of law enforcement.
I'm just kidding.
A claim she believed.
I'm an undercover cop, so just relax, don't be scared.
I was 8 years old. You're taught to trust police and that police officers are good.
The man traveled several miles through residential areas, even passing her grandparents' house.
I saw their vehicles were there, and I told him that he could drop me off and leave me there. And he said, no, nobody's home, and kept driving.
He eventually stopped at the local elementary school that Jennifer attended.
I remember him offering me candy. I didn't take it, of course, because, again, in school I was taught not to take candy from strangers.
The man then drove the child to an overgrown field just down the street.
When we got to the field, he told me that his gun was in the back seat. So I leaned over to look into the back, and he immediately ripped my panties off of me and started to rape me in the front seat of the vehicle.
Jennifer blacked out and awoke to find she was being dragged by her ankles through the field.
He had stopped dragging me. I had my eyes open and immediately shut them and played dead. And he dropped my legs and left me in a fire ant pile. And then he just left.
Jennifer struggled to call for help, but found she could not move or even scream.
Every time I would try to even lift my head, I didn't have the ability to. I still didn't know that my throat had been cut. And I somehow got the strength to just kind of throw my hand on my neck. And when I did that, I could feel that it was open. I immediately just started praying for all my family and everything. I was very at peace. I don't remember feeling scared at that point. I just knew that I was going to die.
But Jennifer has beaten the odds by surviving and regaining her voice.
We're in the car.
She undergoes months of extensive rehabilitation and wears a breathing tube in her throat for most of her third grade year. Her scars are far from just physical.
At first, I was terrified. I mean, I was even scared of any male doctors. I just thought like everybody was the man that had done this to me. I mean, I feared that he would come back and like finish me off. You know, that's what I kept thinking of in my head.
Dickinson police are relieved Jennifer is recovering, but they know that her attacker, a man named Dennis, is still on the loose. And according to Jennifer, he just might be a cop.
I'm an undercover cop, so just relax, don't be scared.
We didn't know whether that was true or not. Until we knew who it was, that was a viable option that we had to look at.
That's the scary part, is that he was still out there.
Just weeks after being taken from her home and having her throat slit, 8-year-old Jennifer Schuett has miraculously regained her voice.
I asked him if he was really a cop, so he said...
She reveals to authorities that her assailant claimed to be an undercover cop, a possibility that terrifies them.
That's every parent's nightmare, because parents tell their children, you trust law enforcement, and then you have someone who's telling an 8-year-old girl that he's law enforcement and doing horrible things to her. That's deeply disturbing.
To make matters worse, the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, is unable to even test for DNA. The stains on the man's clothing found with Jennifer's are simply too small. But the fibers found at the crime scene are a match to the men's underwear found 2 blocks away. And 2 pubic hairs of Caucasian descent are found intermingled with the clothing. But given the current technology, analysts are afraid that testing the hairs could jeopardize the entire case.
We had to make a decision based on, did we want to take a chance on losing the only 2 pieces of evidence we had, those 2 pubic hairs, and try to extract mitochondria. If that extraction failed, then those 2 pieces of evidence for that time frame in 1990 were gone forever.
Investigators make the difficult decision to delay further testing until they have a viable suspect.
Here we have a bunch of evidence, if you will, that was recovered from a scene that and our hands are tied. So we have an individual walking around out there, driving around looking for another victim, and we couldn't do anything.
That suddenly changes in 1993.
It's a man that
Police get a promising lead when Jennifer, now a 5th grader, is reading the newspaper and sees an obituary for someone who looks like her attacker. The deceased man was in prison and, as it turns out, attended high school with Jennifer's mother.
Her mother, in her mind, put 2 and 2 together and felt this must be her attacker. He knew me, he knew her, it must be him.
Investigators consider testing the pubic hairs found among the discarded clothing to compare DNA, a move that would destroy the evidence. Then, they learn that the suspect was killed during a prison scuffle and has already been buried.
We didn't have hair to match with him, but based on his blood type, we ruled him out at that point.
Days turn to months, and the case grows cold. It will take 18 long years before new life is breathed into Jennifer's old case. 18 years, the violent predator is on the loose.
I thought about my attack every day. I still slept in bed with my mom till I was like 15 because I was terrified of the dark, just of him coming back.
In January 2008, Dickinson police assigned Detective Tim Cromie to review the department's cold case files. including Jennifer's.
This case had been here for 18 years. I knew a lot of the investigators personally. I didn't want to talk to any of them and get opinions from them. I wanted to start with fresh eyes.
He asks for help from an acquaintance in the FBI's Texas City Resident Agency. Special Agent Richard Renison. The agent specializes in the most heinous of crimes, those against children.
The thought of an 8-year-old child laying in a field and covered in ants and after a horrible sexual assault, it's just horrendous. It's just terrible to think about.
The investigators begin reviewing the evidence and reach several conclusions about the perpetrator.
Tim and I both thought it was someone familiar with the area or someone local, and mainly because Jennifer's apartment was probably a quarter mile from Interstate 45, which is the main interstate between Houston and Galveston. Yet she was found the opposite direction from the interstate, further into Dickinson, in a very secluded area that had basically one way in, one way out.
Surprisingly, they find that the key evidence, the clothing found near the crime scene 18 years earlier, has been perfectly preserved in a room within the Galveston County Sheriff's Office.
Everything was always, kept just the way it was supposed to. It was preserved very well, and they really felt like maybe we had an answer just lying right there in Galveston County in that clothing.
The evidence is old, and DNA deteriorates rapidly in humid conditions. But DNA technology has made great strides since the early 90s, and there's a slight chance it can still be recovered. Investigators send the clothing to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, to be re-examined.
We were cautiously optimistic, but no, we couldn't send that off and just sit back and wait for that to happen, because there was that skepticism that we weren't going to get anything just because of age.
While waiting for the results of the DNA testing, Detective Cromie learns Jennifer's case has been selected for additional assistance from the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment, or CARD team. This is great news for Jennifer, who is actively helping investigators, providing all the memories and tips she can to catch the predator.
I wanted that time with him in the courtroom. I wanted him to know that he chose the wrong little 45-pound, 8-year-old girl to try and murder.
The FBI assigns a forensic sketch artist to meet with Jennifer to compose an age-enhanced picture of the suspect, who told her his name was Dennis. The Bureau also offers a $10,000 reward for tips.
We were hoping to find that one person who knew of the crime that the perpetrator told about and that would be willing to talk to us now, that was afraid to talk to us back then.
Their efforts go nowhere. All hope seems to hinge on evidence that's been sitting in a box for 18 years.
The longer things went before we heard back from the lab, I think my optimism was fading a little bit.
But in September 2009, 19 years after Jennifer Schuett was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and left to die, investigators get the break they've been waiting for. The DNA lab in Quantico is able to generate a profile from the biological material found on the waistband of the male underwear.
It's still just a miracle that they pulled that profile, just because the clothing was so old.
But the miracle won't be complete unless the FBI lab can find a match.
The issue is that that profile is just somebody's DNA. It doesn't have a name. I didn't know who it was. And it's really someone out there, out of the 300 million people in the United States, there's one person whose DNA that is.
Technicians run the profile through a nationwide database of the DNA profiles of more than 6 million known offenders. They get a single match.
It was about 2:30 in the morning and my cell phone rings. It was Tamara Moretti at 2:30 in the morning calling to tell me that she had a DNA profile and who the person was. It was a pretty cool moment.
And it was simply amazing that we were able to find him.
The DNA profile matches a sample taken from a man who was convicted on a kidnapping charge in 1997 in Hot Springs, Arkansas. His name, Dennis Earl Bradford.
My first reaction when I got the call was, we knew where he was now. Is, my God, how do I put this guy in Dickinson, Texas, 19 years ago?
Nearly 20 years after the kidnap and sexual assault of 8-year-old Jennifer Schuett, investigators finally have a suspect. DNA testing has linked the evidence to 40-year-old Dennis Earl Bradford.
Neither one of us had ever heard of that name, had never been in the investigation at any point, and was a complete stranger to us up until that day.
Dickinson Police Detective Tim Cromie and Special Agent Richard Renison are anxious to learn more about this mysterious suspect.
We had to show that this person was in Dickinson at the time, that he could have been responsible for the crime, and it wasn't some sort of administrative or clerical error that accidentally gave his DNA profile into this case.
At first glance, Bradford seems like an upstanding citizen. He works as a welder in Little Rock, Arkansas, and is married with children.
He had a lot of aspects to his life that made him look like just a perfect, normal family man.
But Bradford also has a checkered past and roots that lead back to Dickinson, Texas. Bradford attended high school there, and arrest records show he had been cited for traffic violations 3 years before Jennifer's kidnapping. Police searched for his old address and hit the jackpot.
He gave his home address as apartments that were adjacent to where Jennifer lived, and probably 200 yards on a straight line if you walked them.
Authorities obtained Bradford's driver's license photo and are stunned by the striking resemblance to the sketch Jennifer helped the artist render almost 2 decades earlier.
You think that's him?
After all these years, you kind of question yourself, you know, just because there's never really been any big leads or suspects. It's like, okay, am I really remembering what he looked like? And everything was right on point with, you know, what I said right from the beginning.
Investigators also learned that Bradford relocated to Hot Springs, Arkansas, 4 days after the attack on Jennifer. But he was unable to escape his deviant sexual behavior. In 1996, Bradford was arrested on charges of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a 35-year-old woman he met in a bar.
Hi. No, I'm good, thanks.
The victim told authorities Bradford refused to take no for an answer.
He offered her several times throughout the night to buy her a drink, and she refused. Later in the evening, she accepted a drink from him.
When the bar closed, the woman accepted Bradford's invitation to go for a ride and listen to some music.
He drove into a deserted dead-end road, a dirt road, where he attacked her.
Bradford sexually assaulted her.
Cut it out!
And actually cut her throat, but it was a superficial wound. held her head underwater in a creek and appeared that he was trying to drown her, and then for whatever reason he stopped. And cleaned her up a little bit and drove off.
The woman remembered Bradford's license plate and reported the attack to police. Although unable to reach a verdict on the rape charge, a jury sentenced Bradford to 12 years in prison for kidnapping. Upon conviction, Bradford's DNA was entered into a national database.
If he knew that we did recover that clothing, I'm sure he had to worry about that. I'm sure he thought every day of his life he looked over his shoulder wondering when it was going to come back to haunt him.
Bradford served 3 years of his sentence before being released on parole in February 2000. He then relocated to Little Rock. Since then, he'd been a free man. But the FBI is about to change that. On October 13th, 2009, authorities pulled Dennis Bradford over during his morning commute to work with his wife.
You're making a big mistake here.
We decided it would be best to have patrol officers pull him over and tell him that he had an outstanding warrant.
I need you to put your hands back behind your back for me. We need to take you downtown and talk to us. What is this all about, sir?
Which in fact was truthful. We just didn't tell him that it was for attempted capital murder from 1990 in Texas.
It was finally over. Jennifer could relax. She didn't have to worry about looking over her shoulder anymore.
Or so police think. Because Jennifer's quest for justice is about to take another startling turn. 27-year-old Jennifer Schuett has waited nearly 2 decades for the arrest of the man who savagely assaulted her and left her for dead when she was just a child. On October 15th, 2009, her attacker, Dennis Bradford, is extradited back to Texas. And Jennifer comes face to face with him.
Detective Cromie and I drove Mr. Bradford back from the airport and brought him to the Dickinson Police Department. And Jennifer was there waiting.
Jennifer can't believe her attacker is finally in custody and wants to see him for herself. Bradford is placed in a holding cell with a 2-way mirror.
I didn't even cry. You know, I just, I was in disbelief. I was like, wow, this is the man that I've been looking for 20 years.
It was very emotional. And Jennifer was the one that was comforting people, saying it's going to be okay.
Detective Cromie whispered in my ear, he said, I told you we'd get him. It was really just like the best day of my life.
Bradford is charged with attempted capital murder. If convicted, he faces up to life in prison. While Bradford is awaiting trial, Detective Cromie and Agent Renison question him about the attack. Bradford is unaware the 2 men are being guided by the instruction of FBI profilers.
We never told him that we had DNA that linked him to the case. We just asked him, you know, if he knew Jennifer and knew the name. He said, yeah, and it went downhill from there for him.
Bradford surprises them by confessing to everything.
She was innocent. And I was a sick, deranged, beat-up little punk.
He also tells authorities he was exposing himself to women just hours before the attack.
I do remember getting out of the car, and I walked over to this window, don't know why, and I just peeked in.
Surprisingly, he asks investigators what became of the little girl he brutalized.
When they mentioned that she was alive, he began to cry.
Oh, thank God. She's alive. She's alive.
Personally, I felt like that was an act. I just find it hard to believe that after all these years and the coverage, the media coverage of Jennifer Schuett and the fact that she was alive, that he would be completely unaware of that.
Jennifer is waiting for her day in court, when she can look Bradford in the eye and tell him how his actions have changed her life. But that day will never come. 7 months after his arrest, on May 10th, 2010, guards at the Galveston County Jail find Dennis Bradford's body hanging from a makeshift noose inside his cell.
Could just be his, narcissistic way of telling law enforcement, look, you got me, but justice is not going to play out in this matter. He has control of that by killing himself.
I feel like I was cheated out of that moment. Like it was just like right before my eyes, it was just ripped away from me. And it was very devastating to me. And still is. I mean, that's something that's still fresh and new, and it's hard for me to talk about because that's not what I wanted to happen. I still hate it,
There are other scars that Jennifer has learned to live with.
I've always wanted, a big family, and so finding out that because of the attack that, I won't be able to conceive naturally, I mean, that was heartbreaking to me. But again, there's nothing I can do about it but move forward and keep a positive outlook.
Jennifer has completed a 15-week course at the Dickinson Citizens Police Academy. She has returned to school and hopes to earn a degree in criminology. For now, she shares her story through speaking engagements.
There are thousands of victims every year like Jennifer. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't live through it. And Jennifer, I think, is able to give hope to people who have been victims of some horrible crime and let them know that it's going to be okay, you can get on with your life.
She always credits the investigators who held her hand in the fight for justice.
I appreciate that they let me be involved because, I think that they knew as much as I did that we needed each other.